We celebrate the crossing of the Red Sea, so it seems appropriate to begin with these words from Dr. King from 1967, which was the last speech he gave to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And he said, "And so we still have a long, long way to go before we reach the promised land of freedom. Yes, we have left the dusty soils of Egypt, and we have crossed the Red Sea that had for years been hardened by a long and piercing winter of massive resistance. But before we reach the majestic shores of the promised land, there will still be gigantic mountains of opposition ahead and prodigious hilltops of injustice. We still need some Paul Revere of conscience to alert every hamlet and every village of America that revolution is still at hand. Yes, we need a chart, we need a compass. Indeed, we need some North Star to guide us into a future shrouded with impenetrable uncertainties." More than 50 years later, we still haven't reached that promised land. We still need to alert everyone to the need for revolution. I know that you as a congregation have spent considerable time and effort on racism, and that Alan Epstein is leading a study group on this subject, and I hope that I am able to add to your understanding. Today, I will focus on the why of the need to be engaged in anti-racist work on the personal, communal, and societal levels. If I'm going to talk about it on the personal level, I thought it appropriate to start with why this is important to me. As some of you know, my parents were both Holocaust survivors, each the only surviving member of their respective families. I grew up knowing the effects of extreme racism. My grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins were all murdered by people who believed that Jews were other, an inferior race. My parents were then refugees in this country. We lived for the first 10 years of my life in the 1950s in Brownsville in Brooklyn, classified at the time as the most rapidly deteriorating neighborhood in New York. And I can still remember the fires. We moved out when the landlord sold the building. We were the last white family to leave the block. I saw firsthand the effect of what I later learned was redlining. Then, living in East Flatbush, I went to Erasmus Hall High School, and our perennial rival for the basketball championship of Brooklyn was Boys High, an all-black, boys-only school in Bedford-Stuyvesant, at the time a dense, very poor, all-black neighborhood, what used to be called the ghetto. During my senior year, on an afternoon in February of 1965, actually a month before the March and Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama, so about a dozen or so of my friends and I decided to go to the Erasmus basketball game at Boys High. It was a close, tense game in a densely packed gym of hundreds of students chanting and clapping. It felt like the very walls and floors were undulating. We were the only white spectators, and sitting at the farthest point from the exit, our predominantly black team won in the final minute. The crowd was angry. By the time my friends and I got to the exit, we were walking single file with our hands on each other's shoulders. I had the misfortune of being last in line. When we got out into the street, all I could hear was people chanting, "Kill Whitey." I was terrified. I was pushed down into the street, lying in fetal position, being kicked and punched, tasting my own blood while people continued to chant, "Kill Whitey." Suddenly, two young men reached down, each one grabbing an arm. They began lifting me up and shouting, "Don't kill him." As they were carrying me away, others reached in to punch me. Those two fought them off and got me out of there safely. They saved my life. They risked their own safety, possibly their lives, to save me. Over time, it was easier to understand people getting caught up in the violence of a crowd than to understand two black young men risking their lives to save some unknown white guy. Though it certainly took me quite a while to sort it all out, I was the target of the rage of the black community feels because of oppression, and I received the grace of being saved by two people able to step outside of the black-white dynamic and act in a fully human way. I think this and my family background explains my commitment and long-term involvement with this issue. Though my story may be more dramatic than others, each of us who presents as white needs to look within and search why it is important for us to do this work. This work of anti-racism is not easy work. We need to be able to hang in there in tough moments. Being rooted in our motivation is important. When we know the why, we can access our passion. Currently, I am on the staff of POWER Interfaith, an affiliate of Faith in Action, formerly PICO. It is similar to GBIO here in Boston. Our executive director is Black, as is about half of our staff of 28. Working through the racial dynamics is an ongoing challenge. One necessary condition of being able to do it is knowing that everyone is committed to do the work, that no one is just going to get up and leave. That commitment to be in the uncomfortable place is essential. In general, white people, especially those with economic privilege, have expectations of being comfortable. The prevailing social norm is being nice. Niceness has the effect of preserving the status quo, which is a culture of white supremacy. Challenging norms leads to discomfort, and change requires us to be uncomfortable. I have heard from people of color that those moments of discomfort are hard for them too. For centuries, making a white person uncomfortable could lead to serious consequences, even death. And now the experience of many is that those uncomfortable moments don't lead to any real change. The commitment to hang in there, to stay at the table, is essential to doing the work. Thus, knowing our motivation, why it is important to us, is the inner work that we each need to do. A note of clarification. As I am using the term white supremacy, it includes the multitude of ways our society elevates white people as the human ideal and norm for humanity, and relegates everyone else as a particular kind of human and always a lesser deviation from the white ideal. As when we consistently mark the race of everyone who is not white while not naming our own. This is in addition to all of the policies, political, economic, social, or otherwise, that ensure the power and advantage of white people over others. Our personal identities are not separate from the white supremacist society that we were raised in, and our patterns of cross-racial engagement are not merely the product of our unique personalities. Just as everyone needs to examine how sexism or patriarchy has shaped their identities and behavior, we need to examine how white supremacy has shaped them. Ibram X. Kendi wrote, "I may not be a producer of racist ideas, but I am a consumer." We are all consumers of racism just by living in America. White people can easily get defensive in conversations about racism. We hear it as a moral critique of ourselves rather than people of color reporting on their experience. Jay Smooth, a hip-hop DJ and social commentator, wrote, think of being a good person, as you would think of being a clean person, something you maintain and work on every day. When someone suggests that we've got something stuck in our teeth, we don't say, "What do you mean I have something stuck in my teeth? I'm a clean person." You will never bat 1,000 when dealing with race issues, says Smooth. The problem with that all or nothing binary is that it causes us to look at racism and prejudice akin to having tonsils. You either have tonsils or you don't. And if someone says, "I think you may have a little unconscious prejudice," you say, "No, my prejudice was removed in 2015. Yet many things in our day-to-day lives cause us to build up little pockets of prejudice every day, just like plaque develops on our teeth, he says. So we need to move away from the tonsils paradigm of race discourse toward the dental hygiene paradigm of race discourse. Smooth counsels, shift away from taking it as an indictment of our goodness and move towards taking it as a gesture of respect and an act of kindness when someone tells us that we have got some racist stuck in our teeth. Robin DiAngelo, in her latest book, Nice Racism, has a useful insight about the difference between guilt and shame. DiAngelo observes that white progressives readily express shame about racism, but hesitate to express guilt. She hypothesizes that feelings of shame can serve as an excuse for racism. It even can provide social capital. Saying, "Oh, I am such a bad person," is shame. It is socially legitimate to express it in liberal circles, and one then does not have to take responsibility. When we express shame, we get support and are reminded of our goodness by others. Guilt means an action that we took and requires taking responsibility. The psychologist Joseph Borgo posits that shame relates to self and guilt to others. Guilt is about doing bad, shame is about being bad. Guilt is about external actions, it is public. Shame is about internal actions, it is private. Shame puts the focus on ourselves and not those who have been harmed. Shame tends to be paralyzing. Feminist theoreticians Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde note that feeling bad about racism or white privilege can function as a form of self-centeredness. Hooks considered shame to be the performance of whiteness and not an indicator that it was being interrupted. Expressing we are ashamed shows that we meant well, that we are not racist. Sarah Ahmed teaches that a white person that is shamed by whiteness is also a white person that is proud of their shame. The very claim to feel bad about this or that involves a self-perception of being good. If I feel bad enough, I both demonstrate and retain my morality. I know personally that I have experienced that. Sometimes in a moment when I become aware of some privilege that I have and then feel bad about it, I have the thought, well, at least I feel bad about it, so I must be a good person. Feeling guilt can be a normal, healthy response to harm that we have caused. It doesn't need to be experienced as a moral blemish. We can make the necessary reparation and move on. In Judaism, we know the steps of tshuva. Guilt, though, has its limits and rabbit holes. I prefer to think in terms of ethical accountability. I was raised in a society that infused me with messages and behavioral models of white supremacy, which I believe are wrong. Thus, I have an ethical obligation to do my best to not act in accordance with those messages. It is not my fault that I have racist thoughts, but it is my obligation to examine how they affect my behavior. I learned this basic lesson from feminism. I was raised in a sexist, male supremacist society. I need to examine how hidden assumptions may be influencing my behavior, especially because I benefit from it. I've been learning about sexism for 50 years now, and I'm still learning. That learning, of course, has taken place in the context of close, trusting relationships with women. I never had and never will have the equivalent amount of interaction with people of color. Some of that learning also came from being in groups with other men to talk about it. To do the learning about racism takes consistent, conscious effort, and I have benefited from being in white ally groups. I understand a white ally as someone who works with other white people to understand and change racist behavior. Ethical accountability requires that if I have the potential to benefit from a behavior that may harm another being, I need to change that behavior. And importantly, I love my partner, my daughters, my women friends, so I want to change my behavior so as not to harm the people I love. We can draw on Dr. King's teachings about love and our own injunction to love our neighbors as part of our why to look at racism. We white folks need to face the internalized superiority that results from being socialized in a racist society. The ways in which we consciously or unconsciously believe that we are more important, more valuable, more intelligent, more deserving than Black people. It is impossible not to get that message growing up in America. Regardless of one's other positions in society, white people know on some level that being white in this society is better than being a person of color. And this, along with the very real doors opened by whiteness, serve to mediate the oppression we may experience in other identities that we hold. We need to reach for racial humility. To do this work, I need to ask myself questions such as, how did I, as a cisgendered white man, internalize racial superiority through the culture's representation of white men as the embodiment of wise leaders or as the peak of evolution? What has it meant for me to be a signifier of intelligence, of wisdom? At the same time, what has it meant to me as a Jewish man growing up in the 50s when the prevailing images of men were John Wayne, that I am not as strong, as powerful as white Christian men? How have these messages set me up to collude with racism? Centering the effects of growing up in the white supremacist culture does not lead to my denying my own experience. Centering on racism can be a way to understand myself better. In this country, as a white person, I can't fully understand my experience of being Jewish without recognizing that I am white. Being white is not a strong identity for most white-presenting Jews. In fact, many, if not most of us, resist it, even as we have benefited from our whiteness. Some years ago, I participated in a training program, and we were given the following instruction. 1, at the beginning of each new interaction with other people, say to yourself the words, "I am white." 2, each time you interact with a white person today, think to yourself, "This is a white person, and these are my people." I had some resistance to the first one, but eventually saw that it gave me insights and new perspective. The second one I had enormous resistance to. Growing up in a household of survivors, white Christian men were seen as the greatest danger to my safety. I'm still working on "these are my people." And I suggest that you try exercises like this. I hope this gives you some indication of the personal work that needs to be done. Now, turning to the communal level. Again, it is important to understand our self-interest. Why a Jewish community should commit to being anti-racist. Dorshei Tzedek has done and continues to do work around racism, and that you are working on I know that you are working on specific congregational practices to be welcoming. So I will be brief about that. It always makes our work stronger when we are clear about the why we are doing it. Engaging in anti-racist behavior for someone else's sake will be limited and ultimately tinged with racism. 7 is a Jewish number of note, so here are 7 reasons being anti-racist is in the self-interest of Jewish communities. These are not in any order of importance. 1, depending on which study you look at, 10 to 20% of Jews in the U.S. self-identify as Jews of color. That includes dark-skinned Sephardi Jews, and that number of 10 to 20% is growing. So in fact, we are a multiracial community. 2, Jews are historically safest in countries that proclaim equality and denounce any form of bigotry, any sanctioned discrimination, or othering of a category of people, because any othering creates the possibility of other groups being othered, including Jews. 3, as American Jews, we need to address racism because it is the core wound of American society, and we desire to live in a healthier one. 4, in the eyes of white nationalists, Jews are the enemy. We are the most powerful threat to the American way of life. They see Jews as behind Black Lives Matter, marriage equality, illegal immigration, and many other things. We are considered the masterminds or the puppeteers. 5, in this historical time and place, the safety and security of the Jewish people is more likely when we create common cause with the broader population of other oppressed groups. 6. The core values of the Jewish tradition: every person is created in the image of God, B'Tselem Elohim, love your neighbor as yourself, V'ahavta kamocha karecha, and justice, justice, justice you shall pursue, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, all require us to be anti-racist to live our values. It is how we fulfill ourselves morally. And 7th, our full spiritual development is limited when we are constrained by racism. Reconstructing Judaism has hired Rabbi Sandra Lawson, a recent graduate of ours, to help congregations develop policies and practices to be more welcoming to Jews of color. And I'm sure you can be in touch with her. And I need to say that I'm actually proud of the Reconstructionist movement for its really commitment to anti-racist actions and the strong steps that it's taking. This brings us to the societal level. An important and powerful book that came out last year is The Sum of Us: What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together by Heather McGee. A theme of the book is how racism is used to change the perception of the public good, and her lead example is the public swimming pool. In the 1940s and early 50s, U.S. cities built enormous swimming pools. The one in St. Louis was actually big enough for 10,000 people. Then the courts began ruling that it was illegal to segregate pools. The majority of cities then opted to close public swimming pools rather than integrate. Millions of Americans who once swam for free began paying to swim only with whites. For example, in the District of Columbia, after a pool desegregated in 1953, 125 new private swim clubs opened in the next decade. A once public resource became a luxury amenity, and entire communities lost out on the benefits of public life. In Montgomery, Alabama, to defy integration, they closed every single public park, padlocked the doors of the community center, and even sold off the animals in the zoo. The entire public park system was closed for over a decade, and even after it reopened, they never rebuilt the pool. Draining public swimming pools reached the Supreme Court in 1971. In Palmer v. Thompson, the court held that a city could choose not to provide a public facility rather than to provide an integrated one, because by robbing the whole public, they were spreading equal harm. Hugo Black, the justice, wrote, "There was no evidence that state action affected Negroes differently than whites." And here's another example in education. In the 1940s and 50s, back when the public was nearly 90% white and the students who were going on to college were mostly white and mostly male, government picked up the tab, whether it was state government funding the costs of their public colleges or federal grants. State tuitions were minimal. The government walked away from this deal around the same time that the college-going population became more diverse, and you started to see the privatization of public colleges. So by now, the majority of states rely on tuition dollars for the bulk of the costs of college, and we shifted at the federal level from grants to loans, and student debt for everyone has exploded. The narrative that white people should see the well-being of people of color as a threat to their own is one of the most powerful stories in America. A recent survey showed that the average white person sees racism as a zero-sum game. If things are getting better for black people, it must be at the expense of white people. A highly respected survey from 1956 showed that nearly 2/3 of white people in this country thought that the government should provide a minimum standard of living and guarantee a job, an astounding contrast to attitudes today. And then between 1960 and 64, white support for these big government guarantees for everybody cratered, dropped nearly half to 35%, and has stayed low ever since. What caused such a dynamic shift in a few years? What happened between 1960 and 64? White Americans watched the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. They saw black activists actually demanding those same kinds of economic guarantees. They heard Kennedy start to speak about civil rights and make promises, and then just a few years later, Johnson signed civil rights legislation. All of a sudden, government was seen by many whites as on the side of black folks. Ronald Reagan used this perception for his own agenda, which was to lower taxes and blunt the government's ability to challenge concentrated wealth and corporate power. Reagan railed against welfare and the war on poverty and told white voters that the government was the enemy because it favored black and brown people over them. The result was a revolution in American economic policy, from high marginal tax rates and generous public investment in the middle class to a new policy of low taxes and low investment in public services, including public works. This new economic policy has resulted in a less than 1% annual income growth for 90% of American families for 30 years and led to the largest gap in income and wages in American history. Without the cudgel of racism, we could have fiscal policies that would benefit the majority of people. The right has been able to get many white people to believe that government policies are on the side of these undeserving people of color, and so support for Medicaid for all or for adequate school funding is thought of as favoring people of color. This warping of the idea of the public good lies at the heart of many of America's ailments. People of color are hurt more acutely, but the vast majority of white people lose out as well on education, healthcare, housing, and good wages. The why here is that we engage in anti-racist work to benefit the whole society. At this moment, to defend democracy, for example. It is interesting that the single demographic held most in common of the 700 people arrested for the January 6th insurrection is that they live in counties where the number of people of color has significantly increased in the last several years. If you believe in a zero-sum game, you feel threatened. McGee promotes the solidarity dividend, the idea that a multiracial coalition can win gains for the overall public good. She found a moving example in Maine, which has one of the whitest and oldest populations in the country. Residents of Maine with French ancestry are called Francos, and they still experience some discrimination. And they found common cause with French-speaking African immigrants. Together, they built a multinational, multi-ethnic coalition that enabled Maine to be the first state in the nation to vote to expand Medicaid by ballot initiatives over the governor's repeated refusal. What these groups could not accomplish alone, they won by fighting together. It is in the interest of the vast majority of Americans to be anti-racist. Now, having looked at why we need to do this work on the personal, communal, and societal levels, I will close with the words of Dr. King. These are the words he ended the speech with that I started today. He said, "I want to say to you as I move to my conclusion, as we talk about where do we go from here, that we must honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself to the question of restructuring the whole of American society. There are 40 million poor people here, and one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you begin to ask that question, you are raising a question about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalist economy. And I'm simply saying that more and more, we've got to begin to ask questions about the whole society." Later on that same year, he went on to say, "I am convinced that if we are to get on to the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, The giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. We still need to engage in the radical revolution of values for our own well-being and the well-being of our community and of our country. Thank you, and Shabbat Shalom.
Mordechai, thank you so very much. It's amazing to have you with us, not just coming full circle from having started with you on our bima. This is a different kind of bima from really day one of our very first service, but to have you provide your wisdom and guide us on this parallel path that we've been taking. You're far ahead of us, but thank you for sharing your wisdom and your brilliance. And we now have some time, so we're going to open this to questions and discussion. And I'm going to try to help monitor that. So I would say if you have a question, either put it in the chat or try to raise your hand on the screen, and I will see if I can try to keep track of all that so we can have some semblance of order here. So anybody want to start? Chaim, you have to unmute.
Thank you. Mordechai, I've been intrigued by the proposal that that babies born to households below some income level or wealth level be given a $50,000 bond at birth that matures maybe when they're 20 something. Do you have thoughts about programs like that?
I can't say I'm an expert, in those policy matters at all. I've read things about that. I think it seems to make a good idea. It seems to me like a form of reparations in some way. And, children born, certainly in certain zip codes or under certain income levels, and some levels have a significant amount of their future, preordained. So creating some kind of fund like that does seem to make sense. I mean, it would have to be nuanced in some way, but it does seem to make sense.
Okay, thank you. So if you have a question, again, either put it in the chat or use the function, the reactions function, to raise your hand. Lots of praise and appreciation for what you have done and what you provided us today. Just following on that last comment, I'm wondering if I have knowledge of what Evanston has done in outside of Chicago in terms of reparations. Do you have knowledge of other communities that have done some work on reparations or have actually created some kind of reparations program?
Evanston seems to be, ahead of other folks, and they're doing it, as I recall, with a lot around real estate and renting and housing, and the Black community has been hurt. I know that it has become practice in a number of Jewish progressive organizations to take a piece of to have a budget line for reparations. So they're taking some percentage of it and putting it towards reparations. There's actually an active group of folks in Boston who are working on that question of how, at least within the Jewish community, we develop sort of normative reparations practices.
Thank you. Okay, Sue Fishlewitz and David Roberts are with us, and Sue has a question.
Hi, Sue.
Hi.
Hi, Mordechai.
Hi, David.
Thank you.
I'm working with a group of people here in St. Louis from different Muslim, Black, Jewish, across the board, Bosnian. And I wondered if you would, in your schedule, be available to address the group. The reason that I say that is that right now we're developing priorities. We're finalizing our mission and vision. And a lot of what you are sharing cuts across, including the 20,000 Africans who live in St. Louis from different countries. And I think one of the things that we have agreed to do is from time to time to have a session dedicated to visions and points of view. And so I just will connect with you in another setting, and it's wonderful to see you. And I remember Brandeis when you led our first service, so that was great. Thank you.
Thank you, David. It would be my pleasure.
So for those of us who don't know, Sue and David were also among our founding members and then moved away to St. Louis shortly afterwards, but I understand they're back with us as of recently. So welcome. So Ora Grodsky and Jonathan Rosenthal ask, do you have advice or steps for strategies for our congregation in its journey to become a more welcoming anti-racist community? And I know that's a big question that we could probably spend the rest of the day talking about, but just a couple of thoughts that you might have along those lines.
Well, it's a little bit hard for me to comment because I don't know what you're already doing, and I know that you're doing things already. So I don't have the exact context. And as I said earlier, Rabbi Sandra Lawson has been hired, one of our graduates has been hired by the movement to answer exactly those kinds of questions, and is I think is preparing a manual or a set of protocols for congregations to be able to do this work. The basic piece of advice is, along the lines of what I said, is we have to be able to examine, our own behavior. It's to create a welcoming atmosphere so people feel, when people of color join the congregation, they feel welcomed. And so one chunk of that is just our own personal work that we have to do. I know in the last couple of years, every year around high holidays, a group of Jews of color put online things you should and should not say to a person of color walking into your congregation who you do not know. You don't say things like, when did you become Jewish? And you don't say things, how did you get here? Or those are classic no-nos. So it's hard for me to say outside of the context of knowing what you're already doing, specific advice, but there are resources out there and more being developed every day.
Great, thank you. So I'll just add a couple of things. The Reconstructionist movement is doing a couple of programs, on this, including sharing a curriculum, a course that has been developed in the Jewish community of Amherst, another Reconstructionist community called Stolen Beam. And there was an email that went out about that just the other day from the community. And if anybody didn't get that and is interested, I'm sure that Melissa could forward it on, or I would be happy to. And I know that on the ritual committee, we were also working to have Rabbi Sandra Lawson join us for one of the Shabbat mornings when Toba is on sabbatical, the next part of our sabbatical. So we will keep you posted on that.
I'll give a plug for the Reconstructing Judaism Convention happening in March. Sandra and I are going to be co-leading a couple of workshops about racism and anti-Semitism. Sandra and I have done that in some other places in the past.
So lots of questions pouring in. I think back to the personal level, there's a couple questions. One that relate to this. One is to hear a little bit more about the moments of discomfort and how you have handled them by Matilda. And Sherry Galpert says, similarly, as a diversity trainer, she is accustomed to getting a lot of resistance and anger from participants. And what do you do to stay centered and non-defensive in those kinds of situations?
Great questions.
And
in the moments,
managing the discomfort instead
in the moments when I can stay centered and hang in there, it's trying. It's a meditation, and being able to watch one's feelings and reactions is enormously helpful. To be able to, stay, when I can stay one step away from what my emotional reactions or triggers might be, then it's easier for me to hang in there. To also know that my racist thoughts are going to be part of the tape of my head because of what I, imbibed, and I don't necessarily need to judge myself for having those thoughts. So if I get away from judging myself, and then I can get away from judging other folks in the room, then I have a much better chance of staying centered and being in those uncomfortable moments. So whether it's dealing with the resistance or dealing with the uncomfortable moments, staying out of any judgment posture is really helpful. Going back to thinking of everybody is trying their best in doing this is also really helpful. I find that when I'm dealing with resistance, if the space permits, I will try to ask questions of folks to see what is at the root of the resistance. Generally there's some pain, some trauma, which is at the root of the resistance. And if I can tease out what is the root of the resistance, where is that person's ego caught in the resistance, where is that person's emotional self caught in that resistance, I have a better chance of working with them. I certainly don't want to challenge or in any way delegitimize their emotions. I remember running a workshop where there was another child, there's survivors in the room, who got really triggered by something, and the more I could affirm his pain, the more I was able to reach him. So, dealing with resistance is, I find, some combination of affirming the person's pain, listening to what their feelings are, and trying to get as much as I can to at some more underlying cause of the resistance, can work. And sometimes, a workshop will allow that, and sometimes it won't. Also really working hard to not have people feel judged or feel guilty. I mean, that if your attitude or other folks is going to end up with people feeling judged or guilty, there's really very little way forward. So those are just, some things. Happier to have a longer conversation at some point.
Right. So I noticed there's a few people who have raised hands. Before I go to those, I want to just mention, I think it was alluded to before, but I talked about what the movement on the larger level is doing, but also that remind people we do have our Understanding Race group that you mentioned, Mordechai, that's led by Alan Epstein and a number of folks who are on this Shabbat service. And, if you're interested in this topic and doing work, anyone is welcome to join those sessions at any time. So it's a place where a lot of this important work is being centered here in our community. So Linda Kramer, I saw that you had a hand up. Do you still have a question?
I do. I had heard that Reconstructing Judaism was working on a reparations project, but then interest waned or people got scared and they stopped. Do you know anything more about that? What happened with the reparations project?
I am not involved these days much with really the inner workings of the Reconstructionist movement. Chaim actually might know better than me the answer to that question, or other folks. I have no idea. I'm not at all informed.
Linda, I will add that one of the programs that was just sent out in the email by the Reconstructing Judaism Tikkun Olam group was about that. So if you haven't received it, I'm happy to forward it to you. Donnie Krasa, you've had your hand up for quite some time. Thank you for your patience. Do you want to unmute and share your question with us?
Yeah, so this was a great talk. Most of it on personal introspection and responsibility. But I just want to, and it's hard to tackle national issues and whatnot, but we have plenty of opportunity right on the local level. So Newton's grappling with resistance to zoning changes, which is basically maintaining the status quo, which is the result of redlining and all that. So just, it's hard to think about the national level, the state level, but you can do stuff just on the local level.
Thank you.
Absolutely. You know, increasingly the local level is the place that real struggles and real pushback and real advancement can take place. You know, certainly nothing more local than school boards, and that's where so many of the fights are taking place.
Right. So DB and Lisa, you guys have had your hand up for a while.
Okay, I'm the guilty party. I actually just wanted to share something. I think it was sometime in the 80s when I first heard the idea that all of us are racist. And I was chair of the board of a domestic violence organization, and I knew enough not to say this out loud, but to myself, I said, no, not me, I'm not. And at some point that, whatever year it was, I was walking in a hall after an appointment at Beth Israel Hospital, and I saw a woman of color. It was about 6 o'clock, looking exhausted, walking to the elevator. And she had her little girl behind her skipping. And just in the blink of an eye, I thought, oh, she's propped. I'm sure she's been cleaning floors or whatever all day. And then I got to the elevator and saw her face and realized she was a physician that I had actually seen. And I have been eternally grateful for that moment, because I was lucky enough to see my prejudice. And so I just wanted to share that, because I think those moments are available to all of us, maybe not so clearly, but in one way or another. So that was just on the personal level. Oh, and I just want to say, I want to answer to your point about the local level. You know, the city of Boston just elected its first woman, its first Chinese American. And in a month or two, our cabinet appointments and new cabinet functions are so different than anything Boston has ever seen. And so I'm more hopeful than I have ever been that Boston will be able to change in some important and really meaningful ways.
Thank you.
Yeah. I will add here a couple of comments. So Sue Lancer adds that Reconstructing Judaism is working on a reparations resolution, and this hasn't been abandoned, but because of the movement's commitment to participatory decision-making, things can move a bit slowly. So it's rolling. And if you're interested in this, really, connect with the, with the movement and get on those email lists. I think it's the Tikkun Olam list, but it may even be a more specific one. And then Alan Epstein also put in a reminder that the next meeting will be February 24th at 7 p.m. of the Understanding Racism group. Okay. Other questions or comments? I don't see any hands up, but I can't see everyone on the screen. And is there, if I neglected to find your question in the chat and you want to unmute and ask it, feel free to go ahead and do so. All right, so if there's, I know, as I said, we could talk about this all day, but I think we've managed many of the questions in the moment. I know this is something that we will continue to work on, think about in many, many ways, and hopefully we will continue this discussion with Rabbi Lawson sometime in the late winter, early spring. I want to just take this moment to thank you again, Mordechai. We are so delighted. Our only regret is that you couldn't be literally standing on our bima again and have all of us there to be just smiling and beaming at how wonderful it is to have you with us and to still maintain this powerful connection with you so many years later. So we feel so grateful for that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn the service closing over to Dan. And then we will be led in a song, a very moving spiritual song relevant to the day by Ora Gladstone. So Dan, you're on.
Thank you, Cindy. So Mordechai, before I do that, I have to take a page from your book and say, first, on the personal level, what a pleasure to see you and hear your voice again, not to mention your wisdom. It's wonderful. Let me keep it simple.
Thank you,
On the
Dan.
communal level, again, I have to echo what Chaim said and remind or inform people who haven't had the pleasure and the privilege of knowing you for so many years, how hugely supportive you were when we birthed this community and how much you shaped so much of its tone and values with us. So thank you for that. And I guess I should say on the societal level, a thank you for all that you're continuing to do through the various organizations within this movement and outside of it. So thank you on all three of those levels that you named for us. Hugely
Thank you, Dan.
appreciated. Yeah, and wonderful to see you. So ordinarily we say Amisha Berach before the last Aliyah. So we will still do that now. And this is an opportunity for people who are thinking and holding in their hearts individuals who are in need of healing, either yourself or somebody you are caring for or someone you are thinking about. And we'll sing the Debbie Friedman tune that we do together. And as we do that, please feel free to put in the chat the names of people you are thinking of. Mi sheberach avotenu mikor habracha leimotenu. May the source of strength, who bless the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen. Mi sheberach imotenu mikor habracha leavotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say, Amen. May all who are ill recover and find strength. May all those who are tending to those who are ill find strength and satisfaction in the work that they are doing.